Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be looking at one of my very first models, this Redland diesel shunter by Hornby, based on its Class 06 model. I got this as a present from my nan and granddad over 20 years ago. We're going to do a quick battery test now to see if this works, as this has been in storage for many years. Doing the normal battery test with a 9V battery shows that this model isn't showing any signs of life whatsoever. Even connecting the battery directly to the wheels, there's no life from the motor, so this is going to have to be stripped down. Considering its age, this model isn't in too bad a condition, although the cab is loose as all the securing tabs have snapped off over time. We will look at refitting this to the chassis plate later on. The bonnet itself isn't too bad, so we'll get a plastic tub to keep all the parts in while we strip this down so we don't lose anything, and we'll take a look at the motor and the chassis. Looking at the bonnet of the model, I'm quite fortunate that the horns haven't fallen off and been lost, as that is a common thing with these models. One of the handrails are snapped off, and as I said, there's some corrosion to the actual die-cast running plate. Undoing the clips allows me to remove the running plate from the chassis. I don't know why the paint has gone like this, but it seems to have oxidised and has caused pitting on the metal. So I'm going to have to remove all the plastic parts, the buffers and handrails, etc. as I plan to strip the running plate using the caustic soda method, and this will melt the plastic parts, so they all must be removed. I removed the handrails by tapping them gently with a small pin hammer, and I was successful in removing them this time. However, some models these are heavily glued in, so I don't recommend using this unless you intend replacing them in their entirety like I'm going to later on in the build. To remove the buffers, I simply just pull them off with a pair of long nose pliers, and I use this scriber just to punch out the broken leftover bit of handrail so that no plastic is melted when I strip this model. The buffers simply just pull out as they are a friction fit inside the cast metal buffer housing. Removing the parts has also damaged the red paint. I'm unsure why this paint is not adhering to the chassis plate like it should do, but there's something obviously gone amiss. Using a glass hot dog jar, I place the running plate into the jar and then cover it in its entirety with freshly boiled water out the kettle. If you attempt this method, please be careful and try not to burn yourself. Adding a small amount of caustic soda at a time, the reaction starts in the water. However, the paint doesn't seem to react at first. When I did this with the Hornby Redland model, it was an instant reaction, and although the paint appears to be fizzing on this running plate, it's not stripping it very quickly. I leave the running plate in the water for about 5 minutes and it does start turning red. However, as you can see through the water there, the black paint doesn't appear to be affected at all. I'm really at a loss as to why this has happened. It must be a special kind of paint or a special kind of alloy that Hornby used on this model. The pitting is now clear to see, and even though I've removed the red paint, you can see that it affects the whole of the running plate. It is quite bumpy and rough too to the touch, so I'm going to give it a good polish with this brass brush wheel in my Dremel. This seems to remove the paint pretty quickly and easily, so I'm going to do the whole running plate with this and then give it a coat of Halford's grey primer. It's important when you use these brass wheels to wear eye protection, as no matter what brand you use, little tiny brass fibres do fly off and you don't want to get one of them in your eye and end up with a visit to the hospital. So putting on a pair of safety glasses is essential. You can see now that it's come up really nice with the brass wheel, and I'm going to do the entire chassis. Underneath I use a cone type brush to get in all the corners, and once it's done it is very smooth and all the pitting and oxidisation has been removed. I'm now going to give this a coat of primer, as I said, and leave it to dry. This is the primer I use. It's just standard Halford's grey primer, and I use this on all of my model work. It's very handy and it's quite cheap for what it is. Now, turning my attention to the actual running chassis, I'm going to remove the motor by firstly removing this spring clip which holds the end of the motor in, and then unscrewing the small Phillips screw from underneath to release the motor housing itself. Once that one screw is removed, the whole ensemble just pulls out and you can remove everything, and you can see in there the brass pickups. Considering its age and how this has been run, there's not much fluff, crud and dirt in there, just a minor amount that will need removing later. The bottom of that motor mount will need insulating tape putting on it later when we DCC fit the model. The pickups on this model come out relatively easily. If you turn the chassis upside down, you can just push them out with a pair of long nose tweezers and they just fall out. These will be cleaned later with a bit of Brasso just to remove the surface oxidisation and any dirt that's on them. This one doesn't work and was bent round the back way, which is probably why the engine didn't work when it was tested with the battery. The wheels are quite free turning and there's not much more work to do on that. Giving the motor a quick test with the battery proves that it works okay, so it was just a case of the pickups not being in contact with the motor contacts. I'm going to remove this interference suppressor as it's not needed, and when I DCC fit the model it will be removed anyway. I'm not certain how they work now, especially with everything being digital. These originally were to stop interference with older television types. The chassis I'm going to modify now, and I'm going to remove these cylinder blocks. I'm going to copy an article that's in the Model Rail Summer 1998 edition and add jack shaft runners to this 06 as per the prototype. In this article it details how to do this conversion, and I'm going to carry this out on my model to make it look a bit more realistic. The replacement side rods come off an old Triang 060 chassis. The crank pin holes on the side rods line up with those on the 06 chassis, and the wheel spacing is the same. So using these I'm going to replace the existing side rods and make dummy jack shaft drives out of old Hornby plastic wheels. First off, I've got to remove these cylinder representations. The plastic is relatively soft, and using these snips I can just cut them off and then tidy the chassis up with a sharp scalpel blade. When you're tidying up the chassis with a scalpel blade, always remember to cut away from you so you don't slip and injure your hand. The same process was repeated on the other side of the chassis. Now, to remove the crank pins and the existing side rods, using the same pair of side cutters I gently ease up the crank pin out of its hole. Work steadily, you do not want to cut through these crank pins and you will need to reuse these later. Once they've been raised slightly, you can use a pair of long nose pliers just to tease out the pins from the wheels. Once it's all been removed, the side rods can be kept in your spares box, but the crank pins themselves need to go into the plastic tub, as we will be fitting these again later on. It is a relatively tight fit, but it does come out in the end. Now, taking the Triang rods, you need to use the side where the oil pot representations face upwards. You can see that one side lines up with the holes in the wheels. Taking the side snips, I cut off the excess and leave about a 20mm overhang from the centre. Putting them on the wheels like this, you can see now that the side rod ends overlap the wheels. Before applying the representation of the jack shafts, I give the chassis a quick clean up using a cotton bud dipped in methylated spirits. I also clean up the inside of the model around the gear, as there is quite a bit of built up dried lubricant all down in the bottom there, as you can see, that comes out on this cotton bud. There is a bit of surface rust as well on the axle and on the wheel treads themselves, so I'm going to clean these up with the brass brush and the Dremel later on. Once all the fluff and dirt has been removed with the tweezers and the cotton buds, I get an old toothbrush and dip this in some cleaning fluid and just rub the gears and clean all the muck out of the gear teeth. This is coming up quite nicely now, and we're almost ready to start reassembling the model. As I said, there's a bit of surface rust on the non-driving axle, so I'm going to have to remove this. Before doing so, I also give the chassis a good rub down all over, just to remove any remaining fluff and remnants of cotton from the cotton buds. Using the brass wheel, I just gently put it on the axle and let it spin itself. This removes all the surface rust on the rear axle. I also do the wheel treads and get rid of all the staining and the muck that has gathered on these over the years. Gentle pressure is used and the brass brush spins the wheels themselves, and they basically clean each other as it spins. The replacement jack shafts were made from Hornby plastic wheels. These were glued onto the chassis with super glue. One thing I didn't do here but did do later on was to file off the wheel flanges and make them just a bit smaller. So if anybody else is copying this method from the book, or indeed from this video, file off the flanges of the plastic wheels so that the jack shafts are just the wheel part itself. This gives adequate clearance from any rail and the wheels, and it lets it run smoothly, as we'll see later. Once the super glue has been applied, I put it in the correct position on the chassis and clamp it in place once I can get it on there, and leave it to thoroughly dry overnight. Whilst that's drying, we'll have a look at the chassis running plate now that it's been primed. The primer has concealed all the oxidisation pitting and it actually looks quite nice. So I'm going to spray the red buffer beam ends and then mask those up and give it another coat of black. Test fitting this before painting ensures that the dummy jack shafts are not foul of the running plate. Again, this was before I filed off the flanges, but that gave even more clearance, and the running plate just simply clips back in place just like that. I applied the red out of a Humbrol acrylic spray can, and it's gone on quite neatly and given a nice even finish. I will now mask this off and give the running plate a couple of coats of satin black paint, again out of a Humbrol acrylic rattle can. I'm also going to mask the roof of the 06 cab up, as this has been quite battered through years of storage and use, so I'm going to mask this up and give the cab roof a quick spray of paint as well. The side rods that I got off Triang, the holes for the crank pins weren't quite wide enough, so using this grinding tool I just grind them with my Dremel just wide enough so that the crank pins fit. This ensures that there's a good fit and they are not going to come loose during use. To reapply to the wheels, I gently squeeze them back in place with these long nose smooth pliers, and then test the rotation and make sure everything's good. This process was repeated again for the other side. Now that the chassis is back from the paint shop, the paint has gone on quite nicely, but I do notice it chips very easily. The primer and the paint doesn't seem to want to adhere to this type of metal, so I may look in the future at redoing this. As you can see now, I'm getting ready to DCC fit the model and have soldered the pickup wires to the brass pickups in readiness and isolated them with some heat shrink tubing. Before doing the same to the motor, I'm going to remove all the fluff and gunk that has built up in the worm gear. I then give it a clean with a toothbrush dipped in some meths just to clean all the crap out of the worm gear, and then give it a final test to make sure it's working before DCC fitting. I'm going to solder the orange and grey wires to the motor terminals and again insulate with some heat shrink tubing, and then give it a test before reassembling into the chassis. Before reassembly, I'm going to just lubricate the axle slightly with this modelling oil. There are no bearings to speak of in this. The plastic chassis acts as a bearing for the axles. So putting on some lubrication and on the gear wheel itself, and I will follow this up with some silicone grease as well, just so it runs nice and smooth and lasts a bit longer in use. I apply a small amount of grease with a cotton bud to the gear on the axle. You don't need much, just enough to cover the teeth and work its way into the worm gear of the motor. To reassemble the model, I start by putting the pickups back in. These just slot into place in clips that are cast into the chassis plate. After they're in, I put the newly insulated motor mount bracket in, along with its plastic bearing that goes behind the motor, and then the motor itself. Then I apply the spring clip that we took out first of all, and the motor assembly is all being put back as it should be. A quick test with the battery to make sure everything's working and that no wires are trapped proves that everything's good. This rebuild is now starting to come to its conclusion. As you can see on the side there, I've added some plastic buffer heads to the end of the side rods to represent crank pins that are into the actual jack shaft runners, and you can see I've also filed off the flanges as I said earlier. One more quick test to make sure everything's running smoothly, and we'll put the running plate back in place. I've also drilled holes in the end of the running plate as I plan to fit air pipes to this model, as the Redland hoppers it would have hauled at Mount Sorrel would have been air braked. I believe this model is based on an 040 shunter that Mount Sorrel actually had in its Redland livery, although it wasn't actually an 06 diesel, it was a generic industrial diesel shunter. To replace the handrails on the front, I opened up the holes to 1.6mm using these hand drill sets I reviewed in my Lidl video, and then I apply 1.6mm plastic rod to replace the handrails. It may seem a bit on the coarse side, but I'd rather this than not have any there at all. And after all, this was marketed as a children's toy, and that's what I had it for, so replacing it and having it back how I remember it is the main objective. These are cut to length and are held in place with some super glue from the underside, and then once dry, the black paint is touched up with some satin black paint out of a tin. Now everything's in place, I'm going to give the body shell a dust over with a dry toothbrush to remove all the dust that has occurred during storage. I also cleaned the window screens on the cab using a cotton bud dipped in some warm soapy water, as I couldn't remove the glazing as it was too firmly glued in and I didn't want to risk breaking it, or indeed the cab itself. Once it's thoroughly cleaned, I reattach the buffers, the air pipes and the vacuum brake pipes. Now I'm going to reattach the body shell. The front bonnet has still got its retaining clips, so this just clips in place quite nicely. The toolboxes cover the motor clips. Although not prototypical, it makes it look busy. The DCC chip simply slides into the bonnet recess, and as it's insulated, I've got no worries about it short-circuiting on the motor, and there's plenty of room in there, even if I wanted to fit sound in the future. One more quick test to make sure that no wires are trapped, and now I'm going to refit the cab using the method I use with the satin varnish. Using this as a glue does not affect any of the paintwork. It creates a strong bond that is easily broken later on should I need to replace the chip or anything, and it holds it in place nice and firmly. Once it's applied, I hold it in place with some masking tape until it's thoroughly dried. Now that the model's been reassembled, let's remind ourselves of what we started with at the start of this. My battered up 06 had a loose cab, the running plate was pitted, it was dusty and dirty and it didn't run, although it had maintained all its detail parts through years of storage, including the air horns, which was lucky. So I've upgraded and modified this model now to DCC running, and I think we've done a good job. I'm pleased it's now back as part of the serviceable fleet, and that the cab is now resecured to the running plate again after many years of being loose in various storage boxes. And this is what it looks like now. It's had a new running plate paint job, its cab's been repainted, it's had a general clean-up, new side rods and jack shaft representation, new handrails, and it's been digitally fitted. I'm really happy with this rebuild, which I thought would be rather simple but actually became quite involved. The motors in these locomotives from Hornby are renowned for being fast runners. I'll show you now how much control I have over these motors now it's got a digital chip in it. This model runs really nice and smoothly and has got a good low speed control. A far away dream from when it used to whiz around the layout at a scale 150 mph. Fitting a chip to this really has tamed it. And also doing a haulage test with this loco was able to romp away with 22 Hornby PGA Redland hoppers with no trouble at all. Here we see the 06 shunting the original 2 wagons I got with this for my birthday many years ago. Having dug them out of storage, they are now forming part of the preserved line rake, which the 06 will haul around the garden. I'll leave you now with some shots of the 06 shunting around with some hoppers, running in the garden and on the layout. Thanks again for watching Trash to Track. Please like, share and subscribe, and there'll be more episodes coming soon. it's interesting to contrast the different shades of green that Hornby have used for their Redland models over the past 25 years.